Have you ever wondered how empires really collapse? Not through dramatic explosions or foreign invasions, but through a slow, almost invisible erosion from within. Have you ever asked yourself what it looks like when a seemingly invincible nation just stops working? Right now, in real time, we're witnessing something most people said could never happen. A country that has defied every prediction, survived every challenge, and built one of the world's most advanced societies is experiencing something far more dangerous than war. It's experiencing internal dissolution. When does a democracy stop being democratic? When does a military superpower become strategically vulnerable? When does a startup nation become an economic risk? These aren't theoretical questions anymore. They're playing out before our eyes in a nation many believed was too strong, too smart, and too resilient to ever face this kind of existential crisis. Today, you're not just going to hear another geopolitical analysis. You're going to witness the real-time unraveling of what many considered an unshakable nation. This isn't about politics. This isn't about taking sides. This is about understanding how even the most seemingly stable systems can reach their breaking point when internal contradictions become too great to manage. We are standing at a historical moment where the evidence is no longer hidden in classified reports or whispered in diplomatic circles. The signs are visible, measurable, and undeniable. From the streets of Tel Aviv, where hundreds of thousands protest against their own government, to the economic indicators showing capital flight and investor uncertainty, to the military reservists refusing to serve, something fundamental has shifted. But here's what makes this moment different from previous Israeli challenges. This crisis isn't coming from Gaza, Lebanon, or Iran. It's coming from within. It's coming from the very people who built this nation, who served in its military, who invested in its economy, and who believed in its democratic promise. Democratic foundations are cracking. A revolt of hundreds of thousands. The first and most visible sign of Israel's internal collapse is the unprecedented assault on its democratic institutions, particularly the judicial system that has served as a check on government power for decades. What we're witnessing isn't just political disagreement. It's a fundamental breakdown in the constitutional order that has maintained Israeli democracy since its founding. The judicial overhaul proposed by the Netanyahu government represents more than policy change. It represents a complete restructuring of how power operates in Israeli society. When a government seeks to eliminate the independence of the courts, reduce the power of legal oversight, and concentrate authority in the hands of the ruling coalition, it's not reforming democracy, it's dismantling it. The scale of public opposition to these changes has been unprecedented in Israeli history. For weeks, hundreds of thousands of Israelis took to the streets, with nearly 200,000 people gathering in Tel Aviv alone in single protests. These aren't protesters demanding policy changes, they're citizens defending the fundamental structure of their political system. But here's what makes this situation particularly dangerous. When people lose faith in the systems designed to resolve disputes peacefully and fairly, they begin to seek alternative means of protecting their interests. Israeli military reservists, the backbone of the country's defense system, have begun declaring their refusal to serve under a government they view as illegitimate. Air Force pilots, intelligence officers, and elite unit members, the very people Israel depends on for its security, are choosing constitutional principles over military duty. This isn't just civil disobedience. It's institutional rebellion. When the people responsible for defending a nation begin questioning the legitimacy of the government they're supposed to defend, the social contract that holds the entire system together begins to dissolve. The economic implications have been immediate and severe. International investors who once viewed Israel as a stable democracy in an unstable region are reconsidering their positions. The Israeli shekel has experienced significant volatility. Credit agencies have issued warnings about political risk, and major technology companies have begun exploring alternative locations for their operations. The brain drain that's beginning to accelerate represents one of the most serious long-term threats to Israeli sustainability. The very people who built Israel's technological edge, its military superiority, and its economic resilience are starting to look elsewhere. When the most talented, most educated, and most mobile citizens begin leaving, they take with them not just their skills, but their belief in the country's future. The economic engine is sputtering. The end of startup nation. Israel's reputation as the startup nation has been one of its greatest strategic assets, attracting international investment, fostering innovation, and creating the economic foundation that supports its military capabilities and social programs. But this economic engine is now showing signs of serious dysfunction that go well beyond normal market volatility. Foreign direct investment, which has been crucial to Israeli economic growth, has begun declining as international investors reassess political risk. Major venture capital firms have started shifting resources to other markets. Technology companies have begun exploring alternative locations for their headquarters, and multinational corporations are reconsidering their Israeli operations. But here's what makes this economic decline particularly dangerous. When an economy becomes overly dependent on a single sector or a narrow set of advantages, any disruption to those advantages can have cascading effects throughout the entire system. Israel's high-tech sector depends not just on technical talent, but on the ability to attract international partnerships, access global markets, and maintain the political stability that makes long-term investment viable. As political uncertainty increases, each of these dependencies becomes a vulnerability. The currency markets have responded with increasing volatility, reflecting not just immediate political concerns, but longer-term questions about Israel's economic sustainability. When investors begin pricing in political risk, it affects everything from borrowing costs to business planning to individual savings and retirement security. The real estate market, always a reliable indicator of confidence in a country's future, has begun showing signs of stress. High-end properties in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, traditionally sought after by both domestic and international buyers, are experiencing reduced demand and increased selling pressure. More concerning is the impact on Israel's most valuable economic asset, its human capital. The same people who drive innovation in the technology sector are also the ones most capable of relocating to other countries when conditions deteriorate. Brain drain doesn't happen overnight, but once it begins, it can accelerate quickly as networks of talent relocate together. The military-industrial complex, which has been a crucial component of Israeli economic strategy, faces its own set of challenges. Defense exports depend on Israel's reputation for military effectiveness and technological sophistication. As internal political chaos raises questions about institutional competence, it can affect international confidence in Israeli defense products. Social fabric is unraveling. A divided society. Perhaps the most devastating aspect of Israel's current crisis is the breakdown of social cohesion that once enabled the country to function despite enormous external pressures. The internal divisions that are now visible were always present, but they were contained by shared external threats and common national objectives. The secular-religious divide has reached unprecedented levels of antagonism. Ultra-Orthodox communities that have historically been exempted from military service while receiving significant government support are increasingly resented by secular Israelis who bear the burden of both military service and tax support for religious institutions. This isn't just about policy disagreements, it's about fundamental questions of citizenship, responsibility, and national identity. When different groups within a society operate under different rules and different expectations, the sense of shared citizenship that holds democracies together begins to erode. The Arab-Israeli divide presents perhaps the most fundamental challenge to Israel's self-definition as both a Jewish state and a democracy. Arab citizens, who make up about 20% of the population, have increasingly been treated as a security threat rather than equal citizens. This alienation not only weakens social cohesion, but also creates internal security vulnerabilities. The generational divide adds another layer of complexity. Younger Israelis who grew up during periods of relative peace and prosperity have different expectations about democracy, individual rights, and international relations than older generations who experienced existential threats and national building. This generational shift has important implications because younger citizens are also the most mobile and the most likely to have international opportunities. When young people lose confidence in their country's direction, they don't just vote differently, they leave. The geographic divide between center and periphery has become increasingly politicized. Tel Aviv and its surrounding areas, which drive much of Israel's economic growth and cultural development, are increasingly at odds with peripheral areas that feel economically left behind and culturally marginalized. These regional differences have been exploited by political movements that promote populist narratives about elite privilege and national betrayal. When different parts of the same country begin to see each other as enemies rather than fellow citizens, national unity becomes impossible to maintain. Military supremacy is being questioned. The reservist rebellion, Israel's military has long been considered one of the most capable and technologically advanced in the world, serving not just as a defense force, but as a source of national pride, technological innovation, and international respect. But this military supremacy is now facing challenges that go beyond traditional security threats. The reserve system, which has been crucial to Israel's military effectiveness, is experiencing unprecedented strain as reservists declare their unwillingness to serve under a government they consider illegitimate. This isn't just about individual protest. It represents a breakdown in the civilian-military relationship that is fundamental to democratic governance. The pilot shortage that has emerged as Air Force reservists threaten to stop flying is particularly significant because air superiority has been central to Israel's military doctrine. The Israeli Air Force's technological edge and pilot expertise have been key factors in deterring regional adversaries and maintaining military dominance. But here's what makes this crisis particularly dangerous. Military effectiveness depends not just on equipment and training, but on morale, cohesion, and shared sense of purpose. When those intangible factors erode, even the most advanced military systems become less effective. Intelligence services are reportedly experiencing similar problems as personnel question whether they can trust political leadership with sensitive information or whether their work will be used for legitimate security purposes or domestic political objectives. Israel's regional deterrence, which has been maintained through a combination of military capability and political resolve, may be weakening as adversaries observe internal Israeli divisions and calculate that Israel may be less willing or able to respond decisively to external threats. International military cooperation, which has been crucial to maintaining Israel's technological edge, depends on partner nations' confidence in Israeli political stability and institutional reliability. As that confidence erodes, cooperation agreements may be reconsidered. International isolation is accelerating. Allies pulling away. Israel's international position has been deteriorating for years, but the current internal crisis is accelerating this isolation in ways that have serious strategic implications. The country's traditional allies are increasingly questioning their support, while adversaries are encouraged by visible signs of internal weakness. The United States, Israel's most important strategic partner, is experiencing its own internal debates about the relationship. American public opinion, particularly among younger demographics, has become more critical of Israeli policies. The current political crisis provides ammunition for those who argue that Israel is moving away from the democratic values that have historically justified American support. European nations, which have generally maintained diplomatic and economic relationships with Israel despite disagreements over Palestinian issues, are now expressing concerns about Israeli democratic backsliding. The Abraham Accords, which represented a significant diplomatic breakthrough for Israel in normalizing relations with several Arab nations, are under strain as regional partners reassess their relationships with a country experiencing internal instability. International investment, which has been crucial to Israeli economic development, is being affected by perceptions of political risk. Multinational corporations are reconsidering their Israeli operations, not just because of immediate instability, but because of longer-term questions about Israel's political and economic direction. Academic and cultural exchanges, which have helped maintain Israel's soft power and international connections, are experiencing pressure as international institutions become reluctant to be associated with a country whose democratic credentials are being questioned. International media coverage has shifted from generally supportive narratives about Israeli democracy and innovation to more critical assessments of political dysfunction and social division. This change in narrative affects not just immediate political relationships, but longer-term cultural and economic connections. Strategic failures are mounting, Gaza to Iran. Beyond the immediate political crisis, Israel is experiencing a series of strategic failures that suggest deeper problems with decision-making capabilities and institutional competence. These failures span military, economic, and diplomatic domains. The Gaza situation represents perhaps the clearest example of strategic failure. Despite overwhelming military superiority, Israel has been unable to achieve decisive political outcomes through repeated military operations. Each escalation cycle damages Israel's international reputation while failing to resolve underlying security challenges. The Iran nuclear issue presents another example of strategic failure. Despite years of intelligence operations, diplomatic pressure, and threats of military action, Iran has continued to advance its nuclear capabilities while strengthening its regional position. Israel's approach has been tactically sophisticated but strategically ineffective. The Palestinian issue, which affects every other aspect of Israeli strategic thinking, has become a source of continuous international pressure and internal moral conflict without any clear path toward resolution. The status quo is unsustainable, but Israeli political leadership appears incapable of developing viable alternatives. Regional relationships have deteriorated as neighboring countries conclude that Israel is more focused on maintaining short-term security than building long-term stability. This perception makes regional cooperation more difficult and leaves Israel increasingly isolated in its own neighborhood. The settlement policy in the West Bank represents another strategic failure where short-term political objectives have created long-term strategic problems. The policy satisfies certain domestic political constituencies, but makes international legitimacy and regional integration increasingly difficult. The point of no return. System breakdown. When we examine the evidence across all these dimensions, democratic breakdown, economic uncertainty, social fragmentation, military questions, international isolation, and strategic failures, a pattern emerges that goes beyond normal political turbulence or policy disagreements. Israel is experiencing what systems theorists call a cascade failure, where problems in one domain create problems in other domains, which then amplify the original problems. This kind of systemic breakdown is extremely difficult to reverse once it reaches a certain threshold. The democratic crisis undermines economic confidence, which reduces resources available for social programs, which increases social tensions, which affects military morale, which weakens strategic capabilities, which damages international relationships, which further undermines democratic legitimacy. Each problem makes every other problem worse. What makes this situation particularly dangerous is that the current political leadership appears either unwilling or unable to acknowledge the severity of the crisis. When leaders respond to systemic problems with tactical solutions, or when they deny that fundamental problems exist, they prevent the kind of comprehensive response that might address the root causes. The international community, which might traditionally help mediate such crises, is increasingly reluctant to invest diplomatic capital in supporting a country whose problems appear to be largely self-inflicted and whose leadership shows little interest in compromise or reform. Think about this in terms of personal or organizational crisis management. When problems reach a certain level of complexity and interconnection, partial solutions often make things worse because they don't address the underlying systemic issues that created the crisis in the first place. The window for peaceful resolution of these problems may be closing rapidly. As social divisions deepen, economic problems worsen, and international isolation increases, the options for positive change become more limited and more difficult to implement. The younger generation, which represents the country's future human capital and democratic potential, is increasingly pessimistic about the possibility of positive change. This pessimism becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy as talented young people choose to build their futures elsewhere. But here's what makes this situation even more dangerous. The longer these problems persist, the more they become normalized. When crisis becomes the new normal, people stop expecting solutions and start adapting to dysfunction. This makes real reform much harder because there's less pressure for fundamental change. The brain drain accelerating as we speak isn't just about people leaving, it's about the loss of the very people who might have been able to solve these problems. When the most capable and motivated citizens give up on their country, what remains is a system that becomes increasingly incapable of self-correction. Lessons for leaders and nations. What we can learn. The Israeli crisis offers profound lessons for anyone seeking to understand how stable systems can suddenly become unstable, how democratic institutions can erode, and how strategic advantages can quickly become strategic liabilities. First, the importance of maintaining institutional legitimacy cannot be overstated. When people lose faith in the fairness and effectiveness of their institutions, they begin seeking alternative means of protecting their interests. This breakdown of institutional trust can happen remarkably quickly, but rebuilding it takes generations. Second, economic prosperity cannot substitute for political legitimacy indefinitely. Material success can mask underlying social and political problems for a time, but when those problems reach a critical threshold, economic advantages can disappear very quickly as confidence evaporates. Third, external threats can unite societies temporarily, but they cannot resolve internal contradictions permanently. Countries that rely on external pressure to maintain internal unity often discover that this unity is more fragile than it appeared. Fourth, Military strength without political wisdom becomes self-defeating over time. The ability to use force effectively depends on the wisdom to know when force is appropriate and when other approaches are necessary. Fifth, international relationships require constant cultivation and cannot be taken for granted. Even the strongest alliances can weaken quickly when domestic politics interfere with international cooperation. For business leaders, the Israeli situation illustrates how quickly organizational culture can deteriorate when leadership fails to address fundamental problems. Success in one area cannot compensate for failure in others indefinitely. For individual career development, the crisis demonstrates the importance of building diverse capabilities and maintaining multiple options. When entire systems become unstable, the people who survive and thrive are those who aren't completely dependent on any single system. Conclusion. A historical turning point. What we've witnessed here isn't just the story of one nation's crisis, it's a case study in how complex systems fail, how democracies erode, and how strategic advantages can become strategic vulnerabilities when internal contradictions reach a critical threshold. The evidence we've examined today, from democratic breakdown to economic uncertainty, from social fragmentation to international isolation, points to a nation that has reached a fundamental turning point. Whether that turning point leads to renewal or continued decline depends on choices that haven't yet been made and leadership that hasn't yet emerged. But the lessons extend far beyond Israel's borders. In our interconnected world, the failure of democratic institutions anywhere weakens democratic institutions everywhere. The breakdown of international cooperation in one region affects global stability. The collapse of strategic thinking in one country provides opportunities for authoritarian alternatives worldwide. Thank you for staying with me through this comprehensive analysis. In a world of quick takes and surface-level commentary, you've invested time in understanding the deeper patterns that shape our global future. That commitment to serious analysis is what separates those who merely react to events from those who understand and anticipate them. Remember, in a world of unprecedented change, the ability to recognize and understand systemic breakdown is crucial for protecting what matters most and building what comes next. If this deep dive analysis opened your eyes to the strategic patterns shaping our world, subscribe to PowerVision for more insights that reveal the hidden forces behind global events. Join a community of forward-thinking individuals who refuse to accept surface explanations for complex realities. Never underestimate the speed at which stable systems can become unstable when their foundations begin to crack. Keep questioning the obvious, keep building for the long term. And remember, this is PowerVision, where we don't just watch history unfold, we decode the power dynamics that shape tomorrow. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay strategic, and never stop seeing beyond the headlines.